And a very good afternoon, and you're all very welcome at the IISS. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bastian Giegerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis here at the Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome back my good friend Sven Biskop, who will speak today about permanent structured cooperation, renewing attempts at EU defense integration. There's obviously a lot going on in that field. And Sven has followed it very closely. Sven, as many of you will know, is the director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Institute in Brussels, and has a number of other affiliations as well. He's teaching at Ghent University. He's also, I think, an honorary fellow at the European Security and Defense College. Is that the right way to frame that? And almost as important is the author of an article, European Defense, Give PESCO a Chance, in the latest issue of Survival. Those of you who are members, if you haven't received it yet, it's kind of in the mail already. So, and that's of course the basis for some of the things that Sven will talk to us about today. We are lucky. It's what people would call in-time delivery. Sven had an engagement in Baku yesterday and flew back overnight, and just despite Heathrow's best efforts, just made it back made it here just in time. So, Sven, I propose you'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and we'll bring it to a timely close at around 1:30, because I know people have other obligations in the afternoon. But with that, Sven, over to you.
Thank you, Bastian. Thanks for inviting me, for giving me a chance to talk, and apologies for making you so nervous. It's not Heathrow, but Lufthansa, actually, because we arrived on time in Frankfurt, and we boarded, and then the captain said that there was a scratch in the paint on the tail, and apparently this had to be fixed. This is Deutsche Gründlichkeit. I think in Belgium we do the same, but differently. If it's completely worn out, we'd put a lick of paint over it to pretend that it's still good. But here I am, and I'm very happy to be so. It was, by the way, the European Security and Defense College that invited me to Baku, so even there they are interested in the ins and outs of European defense, or at least if the Commission sponsors them, they are happy to pretend. And the food was good. My take on permanent structured cooperation, PESCO, is sort of one of cautious optimism, I suppose. I would want it to work, I would wish it to work, but I've written many articles since, for exactly 20 years now, announcing the great breakthrough in European defense, which then did not quite materialize. So I'm quite confident that PESCO will, generate another small step, but we don't need that. It's not worth the hassle, because it is a bit of a hassle. So we need to make a major breakthrough. But I am still, though, cautiously optimistic, because PESCO is a bit different, and that's my first point. So it has more chance of working than all the other initiatives. Not perhaps because it's legally binding, because again, I'm Belgian. There's lots of stuff that's legally binding. I still don't do it. But because it's become institutionalized, which means that whether you want it or not, every year you have to submit an implementation plan. You will be judged by the council, by your peers. And so at least you cannot escape explaining why you haven't done anything. It's a bit like the NATO defense planning process in a way, which, most allies don't meet those targets either. But NDPP is not going to go away. It's a permanent process. And so this PESCO will not just fizzle out like so many other initiatives before it. It's become an institution. The box is there, but it could still, of course, end up an empty box. But for the first time, there's also a carrot, which is the Commission money. In the next multi-annual financial framework, the next budgetary period, the Commission wants to spend €1 billion per year for capability projects, which is something completely new. Now, it's not that much money if you compare it to I think that the 25 PESCO states, so that's everybody but the UK, Denmark and Malta, they invest about 35 billion per year. if I can trust the military balance, and I'm
course
sure
you
I can. So then 1 billion is not huge, but still, if you use it wisely, you can direct what member states do, and I think it's the Commission's clear intention that if PESCO works, that they want to increase this money in coming budgetary periods. Of course, this money also comes from member states, but it's in a way a pot of common funding that you create for defense, which I think I'm all in favor about. So my first point is it has more potential than all the previous initiative. Second point, it will not work of itself though. It will require sustained leadership. For once, this was not initiated by Brussels, but it was initiated by Paris and London. It was a bilateral meeting last year in July where Germany and France announced that they would try to activate PESCO again, because we already tried in 2010 and we failed. And then things moved surprisingly quickly from the announcement in July to the decision in December activating it and 25 member states joining. And basically the EU institutions in a way jumping on the wagon, on the train afterwards, which was interesting to see. But so this will only work now if France and Germany will continue to demonstrate the same amount of leadership. I think Paris and Berlin have been very smart in always associating Italy and Spain, and so most of the proposals have immediately been co-signed by those two. Then in the second round they also associated Belgium and the Netherlands and Finland and the Czech Republic. That was sometimes a little bit less consequential. At times the papers were handed out for comments in the morning, and comments were expected by noon, so not that much margin of maneuver. But so it's clearly member state driven. But now those who took the initiative, I think, have to set their example. Because in theory there is a stick. I mean, if you don't meet up to your commitments, you can be kicked out. But of course, that's not going to happen. Because if the only sanction you have is the nuclear option, that's not going to be used. So I think what we need to do is rather create a sort of culture of compliance. And France and Germany, who initiated it, have to initiate this culture of compliance by setting an example. And in a way, they are already doing so, because at their bilateral summit last year, they also announced that in a number of major capability fields, they would at least, the two of them together, take new initiatives. So think about the future combat air system is a good example, but they're also talking about tanks and other areas. That there would be but one, that's the idea, but one contract awarded by France and Germany together. So a single set of requirements for the two countries. And for me, this is the core of PESCO, really. If France and Germany would effectively do this and manage to bring on board some other countries, then it will work. Then the others will have no choice but to join in, or their defense industry will not survive. But vice versa, France and Germany still need others, because if you're building something like a fighter aircraft, even if France and Germany buy it, that's still not enough to make it economically viable. So for me, this Franco-German axis is the core of PESCO. That will make it or break it. Now, third point, what is PESCO doing? Focuses on capability projects. That's the most tangible, of course. People like that. The first list that was published is about 17 projects. It was not so impressive. It was drawn up in some haste, and many of those projects on that first list are, many of them are still very vague. They're basically just an expression of intent, or they were going to happen anyway, PESCO or no PESCO. So the added value of most of this first list is limited, but you can see the politics of it. Once it became not done not to join it, then France and Germany also had to accept some of the other member states' projects. But now there's already a decision that in November, in a couple of months, we will have a second list of projects, and there's already a Franco-German food for thought paper been published since the article came out that doesn't propose the projects, but that proposes a grid to assess them, and that clearly says, look, the first one, okay, but as from now, a project can only be a PESCO project and so qualify for EU funding if it meets one of the priority shortfalls that the EU collectively identifies. Otherwise, of course, you're still free to do it. You can do what you want, but it cannot be a PESCO project. And that is the way to go. So we should do through PESCO what we can only do through PESCO. You know, the projects that meet the strategic shortfalls that no single member state, even if it wanted to, could address by itself because it's just too expensive. Strategic lift, ISTAR, etc., etc. But I think, in addition to the projects, there's another layer to PESCO that is not also entering the debate. Suppose that a project works and a couple of countries therefore all acquire the same equipment. Why would you afterwards divide it up between them? Suppose that you're all buying a drone, for example. Why not keep then those drones together and operate them as if they were a single fleet? And you know, you can still have your Belgian-owned and German-owned and French-owned drones with a little flag on the tail. But the whole maintenance structure, the logistic structure, the training, the command and control, you can make a single multinational structure and save a lot of money. And if you go further, you can even say, well, perhaps if we sort of begin to merge our enablers, then later on we should also begin to anchor our actual maneuver units, our combat units, into permanent multinational structures so that they are more deployable to increase the readiness. And this idea is in the air. There's one PESCO project with an atrocious acronym, the CROC, the Crisis Response Operational Core. I mean, if I were a military man, I would not want to be deployed on the CROC, I think, you know, CROC monsieur, CROC madame, I'm not sure. And a CROC is not exactly military footwear, I suppose. But this is sort of it, saying we should create a multinational force package that is with hopefully pre-identified units that can have pre-identified enablers. Not a standing force, definitely not, because you know, those don't work. But so that you know what is really ready to go. And then President Macron gave a big speech in September where he spoke about the European Intervention Initiative. And when I first heard that, I thought he was talking about this CROC. But then later on, it turned out that the French see this as a separate scheme, completely outside the EU and PESCO. And then member states began a bit to frown. I mean, nobody who's received the invitation has refused, obviously not. But there's a lot of questioning, why are we doing this separately? In a way, the Germans are doing the same, because they already had their framework nations group in NATO, which is basically the same idea. A couple of member states anchor their units into bigger German structures. The French initiative is clearly geared at expeditionary operations, the German at territorial defense, but it's basically the same. So I think there's a risk here, precisely because PESCO will require sustained leadership. If you then disperse the efforts, are the French and the Germans going to be able to sustain that leadership, including at the highest political level where the bandwidth is limited? So in my view, it would make a lot more sense to use PESCO as a sort of umbrella format where you can say, look, can we not bring all of these under the PESCO umbrella, make them PESCO projects, and make sure that we coordinate? Because the point of PESCO, as the Council decisions say, is to create a full spectrum, comprehensive force package. So there's no point to take the French group separately, where supposedly they're going to discuss about doctrine and why do we want to use force and what's our level of ambition, because that should be part of the PESCO group, because the answer to that question should drive what capabilities PESCO should focus on also. So I would rather see PESCO as the single umbrella, the single platform, where Europeans can coordinate all of their multinational initiatives and then try together, one, to realize the EU level of ambition, but also actually to meet the NATO level of ambition. Because if you look at the first list of projects, I mean, this goes much beyond the EU's common security and defense policy. This is not just about creating the capabilities that we would need to do EU operations as we have done in the past. This is about the full breadth of all of our armed forces, right? And one of the projects that's the most talked about is military mobility. Is about easing the transfer of troops across the EU. This has nothing to do with CSDP. This is about territorial defense. In case of an Article 5 crisis, we want to be able to move quickly. So this is the evidence, if anyone wanted it, that PESCO serves all, or can serve, all of our military needs. Which brings me to the final point that I wanted to make about the links with NATO and the US, and I'll conclude with something on the UK. that because PESCOs can serve both NATO and the EU, I think a lot of people were surprised that then the United States so sharply criticized it. And I think they were also a bit irritated because clearly the motivation of that criticism seems to be defense export. And of course, one of the avowed objectives of PESCO is to create also defense industrial autonomy. So if PESCO works, yes, we will buy more European, but nowhere does it say that we can buy only European. And anyway, many of the industries are so intertwined. I think the US misjudged the mood there and got a lot of pushback from many European states, and I would say, look, just ignore them and just do it. And if it works, that'll be the only proof that will be really acceptable. So I would say, look at PESCO as sort of the linchpin, the middle, the linking organization between what the EU is doing on defense and what we are doing in NATO. NATO works with, NATO says what NATO as a whole should be able to do, and then translates it into targets for every individual ally. But actually, that in many areas, no individual ally is going to make any significant increase in capability, just too expensive. And you also know that actually the European allies and partners alone, who happen to make up the EU, Pace, Cyprus, that in some areas they alone will be acting, not all of NATO, even if they may still act under the NATO flag, but it will be the Europeans who will act. So you need a sort of level in between NATO as a whole and individual states, which is the European bloc. What do they want to be able to do alone if necessary? That's the level of ambition that has to be imported into the NATO processes from the EU, and so that you can use PESCO to create a capability mix that serves, that allows the Europeans both to meet their NATO targets, but also to achieve a certain level of strategic autonomy in the military operational sense. Now, to conclude, is this important for the UK still? And I would say very much so. I don't think in a way that Brexit directly affects the success of PESCO, because I can imagine, and even had the UK not opted for Brexit, that it would not have been very enthusiastic about joining such a scheme, or certainly not about being the most integrationist in such a scheme. But I do think that's important that PESCO shows itself flexible towards third country participation, because the problem is precisely that for many projects that we want to do, we don't find enough states who want to join, and so they can't take off. So if in certain areas the UK would want to join, I would say please. I would advocate for strong flexibility. I would also advocate for great flexibility, because in many areas British defence industry is a key player. If, for example, we want to do this future combat air system, I think it would make a lot of sense that you would bring together not just France and Germany, but also the British aerospace industry in this from the start. So there's a lot of common sense that dictates close involvement of the UK, but as you know better than I do, I suppose, the politics of it are very tricky for the moment and make that very difficult. And you see the UK asking for a sort of permanent link, and the EU for the moment refusing and saying no, it will be on a case-by-case basis, because if we create permanent structures, then other states will also ask that same access, and we won't want to give it to the other states that are likely to ask it, i.e. Turkey. Mm-hmm. So that is where the debate is a little bit stuck for the moment. Voila. I hope I have been able to translate some of my cautious optimism, and I look forward to all your thoughts on this, because anyway I will be writing about this again after the summer.
Sven, thank you very much. We've got a good 40 minutes for discussion, so I hope people take the opportunity to jump in, ask questions, make comments, either on the UK angle or anything else you have said. So please, if you want to join in, do catch my eye. And when I call on you, do introduce yourself quickly, so that while I know many people in the room, I don't know everybody, and Sven certainly doesn't know everybody here. So I'm waiting for people to jump in, but let me start, and then I'll get the audience engaged as well. So just to clarify, get one point out of the way. You mentioned as the key ingredients for why this is different: money, leadership, and legally binding commitments. You didn't talk at all about that problem that stood in the way of PESCO in the past, or things like it in the past, that tension between making it an inclusive process with lots of participants, 25 in this case, and the ability to actually generate output, the effectiveness of a multinational approach. Do you think that has disappeared as a problem because of these ingredients, or will it come back?
I mean, PESCO was clearly not designed to have so many members. Within PESCO, basically, I mean, almost everything has to be decided by unanimity. But that's why I think the leadership issue is so important. I think it would be a mistake. Some read the French reaction and Macron's separate initiative this way, that they're already frustrated with PESCO before it has started, and so they say, well, let's do our own thing. I think that would be a mistake, because if you say up front, well, okay, now it's not going to work, well, yeah, then it will not work. I think it can work because once you're in, I mean, it is quite possible not to do very much, but it would be very difficult to block others from doing what they want to do. That, I think, would be politically very tricky. So if the core, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, with some others advances, then I think it can work. And what I think is that de facto you will get some sort of core group within PESCO. Nothing institutionalized, I would definitely not advocate that, but those who are actually taking part in the really strategic projects, those who are willing to go the furthest in merging some of their capabilities, that this will be the de facto leadership core of it, with others sort of, advancing more slowly.
Robert, please.
Robert Wall, Wall Street Journal. On PESCO projects, how ambitious, given it was a bit of a letdown, the first list, how ambitious do you think they'll be? And then secondly, I mean, I guess to some extent, I always wonder, will the EU, will the members try to use this as an opportunity to get truly cutting-edge technologies, maybe where the US actually doesn't have them, and therefore perhaps also get market presence? Or will it just be what I would call Me Too projects? Okay, well, we'll also have a Reaper, the Israeli, because we don't want to buy the Israeli one or the American one, right? So I'm just wondering what your sense is of the thinking among the core members.
Yeah, I think for the overall for the projects, they will now take 2 or 3 of the new priorities that the capability development plan that European Defence Agency is in the process of finalizing. They will take some of those and do something with it, and a lot of that will probably be in the field of strategic enablers. I also think that at some point France and Germany should bring the ideas that they have now announced, such as FCAS, they should bring them to PESCO at some point. I understand that you can't do that from the start, because if you want to design a new aircraft, you're not going to say, let's sit around the table with 25 and decide what it's going to look like, because it's not going to look like much. So with a smaller group, they will probably define the requirements first, and then take it to the bigger group and say, now the rest of you can join, but this is what it's going to be. But that will probably happen a bit later, not now. I also think that in the first instance we'll probably be in the realm of what you nicely call the Me Too projects. But clearly on the Commission side is the idea to also push innovation, because in addition to the billion for the actual projects, there will be $500 million a year for R&T also. And again, I think these budgets are set to be increased. And I'm quite strongly convinced that this political agenda of the Commission will be carried over into the next Commission. And as you know, there's a lot of rumors in Brussels about, will the Commission create its own Director General for Defence, which scares people who are not now working for the Commission. And I'm a bit agnostic on that. I would say the existence of an agency is not a purpose in its own right? So that goes for the existing agencies. Of course, the creation of a new one is not an objective in its own right. But if we think that the best way to get things done is to create a commission DG, I would say why not? Because a commission has one advantage: one, it has money, and two, it's a machine that works. If the wheels start turning, then things progress usually.
Can you just, before I call on the next question, can you just say a little more on that, if there is anything to say on it, on that defense industrial angle that was lurking there in the question of, and you alluded to it as well, PESCO as a driver for defense industrial innovation, perhaps, or indeed claiming market share and that autonomy element on the industry side. I mean, how strong do you think it is as a factor?
I think it's the main driver in the Commission, and I think it also is part of the motivation of some of the key players. I mean, certainly part of the French community that is driving this is thinking this is our chance, right? Mm-hmm. There's a negative side to that as well, because some of those people are saying this is our chance not also to build something European instead of something American, but some of them are thinking this is our chance to kick out the UK. Sort of a revanchist attitude, which I think is mistaken, but it's there. It's a fact. So there's pros and cons to this. So I think what is now key is that we say, okay, this is part of the ambition to defense industrial autonomy, but driven by the needs of the governments. Mm-hmm. Right, not by what the companies think we should have, and that is why the capability development plan is so important, I think, and to follow that, because it is a process that exists anyway.
Yes, sir.
My name is Karan Nadeem. I am the Army Advisor from Pakistan. I have two questions. One is, do you think that the key driver of spearheading or accelerating the process of PESCO from July to December in a 5 months' time has been, President Trump as President of the United States, as he, used the coercive strategy to ask the NATO members to, increase the defense budget to 2%. Is this the sense of insecurity amongst the European nations that, the NATO is becoming ineffective in a sense that, United States might not come for the rescue should there be a below Article 5 situation, or even if there is one? Second, just read an article which was published in Survival. It says that 5% on one aspect, 20% on research and training, research and technology, and then asking the countries to come up with a. Do you think that already struggling economies of the Eastern European countries would be able to match up the desired finances that NATO, European defense, and again the PESCO is bringing in? Do you think that is it doable?
Thank you very much.
On the motivation, I think first Brexit played a role, in a way a bit wrongly, because I think many people had this idea, now we can move ahead. But of course it's not as if once the UK is no longer at the table, all the others miraculously agree on everything. So I think it is in a way a wrong assumption, but it did create the momentum. So okay, even if the momentum came into being for the wrong reasons, we should use it. But then I think Trump greatly reinforced that. Not I think because his coercive strategy, as you call it, and pushing for the 2%, but rather because I would say in most member states defense budgets were already rising. That was because of Putin, not because of Trump, and not because Trump came to Brussels last year. But I think it's rather because he seemed to be so erratic that and he's so unpredictable that clearly you need a plan B. That's just a feeling. I don't know, but Chancellor Merkel met Trump 3 times in a row in the first half of last year. She went to Washington. He came to Brussels for the NATO mini summit, and then there was the G7 in Taormina. And it seems that she came home and she said, "This is not going to work. So we need something else," and that is also pushed very, very strongly. The other point on the burden for the economies, I mean, clearly this is not going to be easy for everybody. I think, in a way, the PESCO commitment is clever because it says you need to increase defense spending in real terms in order to reach agreed objectives. But it's not really spelled out what those are. Now, everybody knows one agreed objective is, of course, at 2%, but everybody also knows that quite a few states have absolutely no intention of spending 2%. They just pretend that they want, but they won't. But of course, you can't sign up to 2% in NATO and then, a couple of years later, sign another document in the EU that says, well, actually 1.5% is enough. So you just say agreed objectives. But it does say, which was also already an existing commitment, it's just now legally binding, however much you spend, 20% has to go to investment and 2% to R&D, and that will force member states to increase their budgets anyway, to gradually increase your budget. So I think this is something that has to be seen as a track, right? You have to progress, but it's not as if you're going to say you need to reach X% within the next year or within the next 2 years. Part of the exercise now is the sequencing of commitments that's still being hotly debated. What exactly does that mean? Benchmarks and what has to be achieved by when. But I think it will be gradual and proportional. So it allows everybody to do more, and just to show that they're progressing, and then I think that will count as saying, okay, we're doing our best to meet the commitments.
Tom, please.
Tom McCain, I'm a member of this institute. I think I agree with you that it's a good hedging strategy to build up European capabilities, either to encourage the US to continue to remain engaged, but if that turns out not to work, then at least you've begun to create a fallback. But this is going to take decades,
yes,
at the very least. And I wonder whether the common funds will have the effect that you described. One of the problems in the past, certainly in the NATO context, is that common funds become an excuse for individual member states not to increase their own spending. But the question that I've got is about sovereignty. You talked about pools of military equipment, military capability. And one of the problems that the Europeans have had to address, and so far have addressed really unsuccessfully, is how you can create either role specialization by country or pool resources which are going to be available in a crisis. And I could well imagine that it's concerns about that led Macron to launch his separate intervention initiative. Do you really think that the members of the PESCO states, having put their men, women, and equipment into pools, will then be willing on every occasion to see that capability used, say when the French want to deploy it in Africa or whatever?
Yeah. Well, on the point of the common funding, point very well taken. Of course, the targets are there for member states, and those what the Commission spends does not count towards member states' obligations. But we should also think about what is actually the target for the Commission itself, because you don't want to sort of create another huge. You have to know what in total is necessary and do you want to spend. So I do understand some people who criticize this, saying, our Commission is creating its own defense budget, sort of. But do we know what's the horizon for that? We should have an idea. We should have a debate about it as well. I think on the sovereignty issue, that can be solved, though. Most models are sort of a combination where you can more easily pool the enablers that allow you to deploy your combat capabilities, which remain of an entirely national composition. That's easiest for naval capabilities, because in the end it's basically only the ship that is deployed. It's still relatively easy for air. It's more difficult, of course, for army, because, of course, also your maintenance logistics will have to be deployed in theater. But there are examples where it works. I've brought many people at many events talking about Belgian-Dutch naval cooperation. But it does work. The point is not to say to add more countries to that one, but to create similar pools between other small sets of countries. European Air Transport Command works, and I noticed that the Dutch are quite trusting in the Germans, that several Dutch capabilities now can only operate if they are supported by specific German assets. There's also very far-reaching integration between the two armies here. And one of the next projects in the making is, I think, a similar link between the French and the Belgian armies, so land forces, that is going to be in the making. And in a way, how to say, either you make a really big pool like European Air Transport Command, and the more countries are in it, the more easily you can organize around it if one country really does not want to be involved in a specific operation. And you can say, okay, we shift the assets, and your assets will be used for other stuff, and the other country's assets can support the operation. Or you create smaller pools, like our Belgian-Dutch naval cooperation, where you're sufficiently close. So I do think you are absolutely right that not all 25 PESCO states are thinking about this. But I think, again, the core of them are. And Macron's initiative, the first step of it is to think about doctrine and scenarios and sort of what are actually the circumstances under which we think the use of force might be necessary. But also the next step would be to then think about common support capabilities for those expeditionary forces. So again, it goes in the same direction, because no single country can actually today deploy very much anyhow without support of the others. Even when the French went into Mali, they have the brigade that they can deploy, but they still need transport from others. They need intel from others. So in a way, the limits on our sovereignty are already there, I would say.
I mean, picking up on Tom's first point, then, I mean, what you say is an appropriate time frame to judge whether this is actually working, because you said it's clearly a long-term investment, and you agree. Yeah. But when do we know that this works or doesn't work? What's a fair? Give it a fair chance. Give PESCO a chance, as you suggest.
I would say within a few years, the first measure of success would be have significant projects taken off. Of course, they will not have delivered, but something like FCAS, has it started, and sufficient member states have signed up to make it work, and that we should know within counting back from the launch of PESCO to maximum 5 years, I would say. Have sufficient important projects taken off that, if they deliver, would really enhance our capability. That we will really, in the end, be able to do some things that we can't do now.
So the ability of PESCO to initiate these projects, and then, whether they then succeed is a whole new question.
But I would say that's because it's kind of difficult to say, also politically, we launch it now and in 30 years we'll tell you whether it was a success. Yeah. You need something in the meantime, and I think that could be it.
Okay. Lucy?
Just 3 questions. The first one is what you just said on the list of projects. You say the one measure of success we see those projects have worked out, but what I don't get is there's a first list of 17 projects that's just been released, and you're saying member states are already working on the second list. So isn't this a bit too much and the dispersion of bandwidth and resources as well? What are they trying to achieve when already doing out the second list even before we see the first list is working out? Second question is again on the European Intervention Initiative and the link with PESCO. So a few days ago there was an interview by Angela Merkel, and she mentioned that Germany would agree to participate in the European Intervention Initiative if it is linked to PESCO. So do you think this would fit what you were saying about PESCO being a sort of umbrella framework for you to see the different German and French leadership? And also, do you think the French would agree to this, given that you actually mean they would lose leadership on this? And the last question is also on PESCO and the third state participation and the link with the UK post-Brexit. So you said that so the UK requires a kind of general entry point into PESCO, but this doesn't match the EU requirements where they want a case-by-case basis entry. So do you know if there's already thinking about what kind of criteria have you set up for the UK, or have you been thinking about what kind of criteria could work for the UK to participate in PESCO?
Thank you, Lucy. So three items. Why are people moving on straight on from the list of 17 when those haven't really been implemented or just about to even take off? European Intervention Initiative and that Franco-German dynamic and Merkel's attempt to kind of bring it back within the tent. And then the question of what could be the criteria and the rules for third-party contributions, and in particular the UK's contribution, of course. Three big items.
Thank you, Lucy. I mean, I had certainly not expected that there would be 17 projects on this first list. I was thinking, we're going to go for 3, 4, 5 or so. Because if you only have $1 billion a year and you divide it over 17 projects, I mean, then it becomes a bit silly. So I think clearly everybody knows that the second list has to be shorter and has to show more focus. But I do think it's not a bad idea to say that every year you need a new list, because it ensures that there is a certain dynamic. Obviously, you cannot launch 17 new projects every year. But if every year you launch 1 or 2 things that are necessary, then I think this is the way to advance. And definitely now there are many areas in which work is needed. If ever we're in the luxury position where we say, well, actually, no projects are necessary, fine. Then we can say, well, okay, we continue with what was happening. But I think we're not quite there yet. But yeah, I agree with you. We should. There's a big risk here of dispersal of effort. European Intervention Initiative. Yeah. I think Germany is not the only state that is wondering why it couldn't be a project in PESCO. I've heard the same from the Dutch, from the Finns, from the Belgians, the ones that I've spoken to about it. So I think it would make a lot of sense. The French argument is because it's linked to your third question. The French argument is, well, but we invited also Denmark and the UK in it. So it can't be a PESCO project, but I would say, well, it can be, but indeed you have to be very, very flexible about that. And I think it makes sense again to link precisely this one, because this E2I is exactly about, well, why do we need force actually? And that should be an integral part of the PESCO discussion. Although Macron could also very well say then to Merkel, well, okay, but your own initiatives then should also be brought under the same umbrella, and we should try to coordinate everything. On the UK, I mean, I wrote a paper for Egmont. We also publish some stuff from time to time, where I pleaded for a very far-reaching permanent involvement of the UK in both CSDP but also CFSP, so not just security and defense policy but also foreign policy, which in a way is even more tricky, I think. So my brilliant or not so brilliant idea was just to say, keep the UK seat in the Council, Foreign Affairs Council and all its preparatory bodies, but it would be a seat without a vote. But they never vote anyway, because they always look for consensus. So a seat without a vote is as good as a normal seat, almost. But the price then would be that you cannot do any shopping then. If you have that seat, you have to respect all treaty obligations on CFSP, and you have to subscribe to all EU positions. So you couldn't say, yeah, well, this one maybe not. So when I published this, most British colleagues who read it said, well, this is far too EU friendly, and most EU colleagues who read it said, well, this is far too UK friendly. So I sort of knew this, but I thought I would make the argument. I say, I mean, I know it's a bit of sophistry, but if you need criteria, you say, okay, we create a special status for European states that are permanent members of the Security Council. They can get this. There happens to be only one. I know it's not going to happen, but it is it's a very objective criterion. Frankly, I don't see why the fact that the UK would receive a certain status, why that would automatically generate the right to the same status for others. I don't see that, actually. You can just say no. You can just refuse. But the feeling is there. And so, as far as I know, in the debate now, the idea is that there would be no third country participation in the level of PESCO as a whole, where the 25 sit together. It could only be in the projects. But even though, of course, not all 25 will sit in every of the projects, it will have to be the 25 as a whole who decide for every project to agree the third states who would sit on it. And that, of course, would make it a little bit cumbersome, but I suppose it's also to avoid that some groups would invite countries who perhaps you don't want into a sensitive area. And I'm not thinking of the UK here, obviously, but there's been nice statements by the Chinese mission to the EU saying, we would be interested to join a PESCO project. Well, perhaps, but perhaps not, I would say.
On information and intelligence sharing.
Yeah, for example.
I recommend Sven's Egmont paper to everybody, not least because in it he admits that when he was a little boy, when other people wanted to be policemen and firemen, he actually wanted to be an Englishman, and now obviously
I've grown up though. So.
Well, a noble ambition, I suppose. Thank you for that. And I really think that point is that you made about there's really no logic that suggests one set of rules needs to apply to everybody who is not an EU member state is an interesting one, because in Brussels it seems to me people immediately equate a statement like that with a challenge to the EU's decision-making autonomy, which I don't think it actually implies. A couple of people on my list now, so we've got a good 10 minutes left. So, Stefan, you're next.
Stefan German, we have the PESCO, we have a NATO framework nation concept, we have the British kind of framework nation concept, JEF. Yeah. And on a more operational level, the European Battle Group, the initiative from France, is standing NATO forces. Do you think in the future that can all coexist with each other? Mm-hmm. And as a sub-question, do you think, especially the JEF, is something like a thorn in the back of the PESCO?
I don't think so, because the JEF is about interoperability and not about integration, if I understand it correctly. And you can be interoperable with many partners. It's only when you're being to integrate, so you're being to merge things, then you have to choose. Because if I say I have a capability A and I merge it with someone else's capability B in E2I, I cannot merge my A again with capability C in the Framework Nations group, right? So if you say we need to go for integration, then you have to be into choose and to align the initiatives. It need not be, so JEF I think is not an obstacle to that, nor is this an obstacle to JEF. It might just mean that if the UK is now interoperable with, for example, a French capability, but assume that in the future this French capability, part of it will actually be merged with a German, Belgian, Dutch capability, then the British part of the JEF will be interoperable with that multinational capability instead of only with the French. But all this can work, but they cannot. If you say we go for integration, then you have to coordinate them a lot more. And also, the point is exactly fragmentation at the national level. The answer to fragmentation at the national level is not a fragmentation at the multinational level. Again, I would say. Mm.
I think in a way, the answer is of course in the name. I think the British concept of framework, or the framework nations concept, is an operational one, whereas the German is a capability development one, and creating multinational formations. But it goes back to Tom's question: would they be used? Whereas the British, I think the answer is that's what they're there for. And the question then becomes: can that come together in one happy marriage in PESCO? Yes, please.
It's Adam Mazel from Rusi. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about military mobility. So you touched on it very briefly. And I think there's some really welcome policy for infrastructure and it's cutting down on the cross-border regulations. But my concern is really about exercise and validation. So it's great to cut this red tape to move particularly heavy equipment. I'm thinking more of the Russian threat than anything else. The reality is a lot of this has to be proven in something close to representing an operational environment. So it's very good that these policies will come online and help reduce that time period. But is it incumbent on the individual members to train and validate whether they can move forces across in a timely manner? And then it seems that a lot of this is pledged for 2025, so that's 7 years from now. And we went from Georgia to Donbass in 7 years. What's going to come online in a more rapid manner to address what I think is a major concern for European security?
I have sometimes a little bit of how to say. Everybody's talking about military mobility, but of course that's not creating any new capability, right? So we should not use that as the flagship of PESCO, because it's just about being able to move the capabilities that you have, to move them around Europe. That's all that it's about. I mean, it's very important, but you don't get more capable because of that. Maybe you can act a bit faster. It is the one that is really moving, though. I think the Dutch are in the lead. They had recently their first conference of it.
Last week, I think. Yeah.
So something there. But in all honesty, I don't know enough about the detail to pretend that I can answer that. Sorry.
I think there's a bit of a difference between the mobility angle, as in reducing bureaucratic obstacles and making sure that people can talk to each other faster, and then what is actually a readiness
those are different
question. And I think those are a bit different. I mean, I remember when I worked for the German government a few years ago, and they looked at this question: how fast could we sort out movement of people and equipment across European borders in time of peace, but in a crisis situation, but not a state of war, which is a difficult one, because once you are in a state of war, then all sorts of stops get pulled out. But and at that point, this is a few years ago, the answer was a month. And the challenge is to get that down to a few days and then a few hours, if you're really serious about it. So I think, but that's, as Sven has said, that, I mean, you could argue that's a new capability because it enables something that wasn't possible before. But I think it's quite different from the readiness issue as such, which is probably being I assume, unless the summit goes south real quick, it would be aired at 11 and 12th of July. I suppose we don't know whether President Trump actually is able to listen to everybody else.
So many.
I don't think that has ever happened before. So maybe that NAC table has a disciplining effect, or maybe not. But certainly the 4x30 initiative and these kinds of things, I think that's where stuff would come online sooner, within the next 2 to 3 years at least. That's the ambition. Yvonne.
Thank you for your presentation. So you cited the Franco-German leadership as a potential point of failure, and I was wondering, can you see any other potential obstacles that might deter states from achieving their ambitions within PESCO. And I'm thinking more of strategic priorities. If we look at the list of the first 17 PESCO projects, we see patterns. So Mediterranean countries are more interested in the maritime domain, whereas Germany, Netherlands are more into house and training.
I wouldn't see it as an obstacle, because precisely if you say PESCO is where we can coordinate all of these multinational initiatives, then everybody can find something that is useful in the big picture. But it doesn't mean that as an individual state you have to play in everything, right? A country like, say, Finland, which is much more focused on territorial defense, could take part in the projects that contribute to increasing our capability there. For example, a country like mine, we have decided that for the army we will focus on expeditionary and go to the south with the French. So we could choose, but you could make sure that the totality of it all actually makes sense and creates this coherent full spectrum package. So I sometimes feel that these differences are somewhat overstated.
Thank you very much, Sven. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm looking for last bits for the floor. But in the meantime, let me ask one more that has been also kind of in the background of what you said, and it has to do with the centrality of PESCO for this latest overall push in European defense cooperation within an EU framework. And you mentioned that there is a push to link new PESCO projects to recognize shortfalls, which means to the capability development process that the EU has. That will in turn hope or possibly be enhanced by what is called the Coordinated Annual Review of Defense. And then, of course, there's money, the European Defense Fund, that maybe people will seek to access by way of PESCO projects, because you get a bonus finance, a top-up from that fund if it's a PESCO project. So, I mean, so you've got lots of moving parts. As someone who's worked on a policy and strategy team, to me that sounds like a recipe for disaster, because you create a single point of failure where everything has to work together or nothing works at all. Which would worry me, but at the same time, there are a lot of people I think in the institutions right now that argue that's the only way you get a really strong dynamic going, by making sure that the EDF is linked to PESCO, that both of them are linked to the capability development plan, and somehow all of this is harmonized over time to a greater degree by the CART process, the Coordinated Annual Review. I mean, are you worried about all these things working together, or do you think that is actually what will create the pull to drag people forward?
I think many of these by themselves would not be very significant, and that if only they are coordinated, then they enable each other. I mean, CART without PESCO, if you don't have commitments, then what's the point of assessing what then? And EDF, if you don't have a process that says, well, this is what we're going to do, then how are you going to decide to spend that commission money? And especially also, there's no point in spending a lot more money if you don't cooperate more at the same time, I think, because the fragmentation is so huge. I mean, I think even if tomorrow, Bill Gates would say, here's the money for European defense, but everybody spends it separately, so all 28 spend 2%, but everybody in their own corner, we would still be massively dependent on the US, because the areas where we are lacking capability cannot be addressed by single states. So you would just waste more money if you spend more without integrating more, is my feeling. But I agree, it's sort of, it works or it doesn't, because the individual bits of it alone, I think, in my view, cannot work.
There's of course that saying, if you need more than one miracle to make something work, then it's challenging. But in any case, Sven, thank you very much. I think you made a strong case for why it is worth giving PESCO a chance, and you explained very well, I thought, the logic as it is currently set up, and I think we here at the Institute, and I'd imagine other people here in London as well, will certainly watch that space, not least in terms of third-party participation and contribution. I personally think the UK has a lot to offer there if it wants. And if it is willing to pay the price, including in financial terms, and that, I guess, remains to be seen. But Sven, thank you very much for joining us, for talking about PESCO. Everybody do read his article in Survival, which is based on a range of interviews and conversations with the people who pushed PESCO forward. So thank you very much, and let's all give him a round of applause for that effort. Thank you.